The hunger of Black Hollow. It was late autumn when 5 friends, Madeline, Carter, Elise, Nolan, and Jonah, set out on what was meant to be nothing more than a harmless weekend escape into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, a trip born from nostalgia and a desperate hunger to reconnect after years of separation, after the relentless machinery of adulthood had scattered them into cities, offices, and quiet disappointments, each carrying the weight of dreams that had shriveled somewhere along the way. And so when Nolan suggested they hike into Black Hollow, a stretch of forest so deep, so ancient, that even local maps rendered it as little more than a shadow, they all agreed without hesitation, their laughter light, their spirits high, unaware that something within those darkened hills had been waiting, patient, teeth bared beneath the soil and stone. The drive was long and meandering, the roads narrowing as civilization unraveled behind them, cell signals fading until they were nothing but static, and the trees, tall, gnarled, their limbs like twisted fingers, crowded closer and closer, the sky shrinking to a narrow, ashen strip overhead as they finally abandoned their vehicle at the forest's edge, hoisting packs heavy with supplies, none of them knowing that they carried not only their tents and rations but the last fragile threads of their sanity. The path into Black Hollow was overgrown, almost invisible, a serpentine ribbon swallowed by dead leaves and ancient roots, and as they moved deeper, joking, snapping photos, breathing the sharp, cold air, they failed to notice the way the woods seemed to lean inward, the way sound itself seemed muted, devoured by the dense silence that pressed against them like a living thing. It was only when they reached the clearing, a circle of bare earth where no grass grew, no birds sang, that the first shiver of unease passed between them, a shared glance, an unspoken question none dared to voice aloud. At the center of the clearing stood an old wooden sign, its letters barely legible beneath layers of moss and rot, reading only, "Beware. Once you enter, it awakens." They laughed it off, as people do, urban minds dismissing rural warnings as folklore, as myth, and so they set up camp, built a fire, passed around cheap whiskey, their voices rising in familiar rhythms of friendship, of memories retold, the crackle of flames casting shadows that danced long and thin across the trees. And somewhere, deep beneath their feet, something stirred, something that had slumbered long and deep and now blinked open eyes that had not seen light in centuries. The night grew colder. And in the windless dark, they heard it for the first time, a low, inhuman hum, barely audible, vibrating through the ground, through the marrow of their bones, and though none of them spoke of it, none of them slept soundly. When dawn finally broke over Black Hollow, it did so in sluggish, gray smears, as though the sun itself struggled to pierce the suffocating weight of the trees, and the 5 friends emerged from restless slumber with faces drawn, eyes rimmed with shadows, their easy laughter now brittle, as if something had drained a hidden reservoir of warmth during the long hours of the night. The air felt heavier somehow, the forest quieter, and though no one said so aloud, each of them felt it. That primal sensation of being watched, studied, the way prey might feel the slow, patient gaze of a predator in the tall grass. Jonah was the first to notice the footprints. They were strange things, elongated, twisted, half-human in shape yet marked with claws or talons at the edges, as if something that only mimicked the human form had walked the clearing in the night. He called the others over, his voice tense with unease, and for several long minutes they stood in the pale morning light, eyes fixed on the prints, until Nolan, ever the skeptic, waved it off as the tracks of some animal, distorted by the rain-soaked earth. Still, they packed their gear in uneasy silence, shouldering their packs with hands that trembled faintly, and pressed on deeper into the woods. The path, if it could be called that, grew narrower, steeper, the forest pressing so close around them that branches scraped their jackets, snatching at their hair like skeletal fingers, and the strange humming, inaudible at first, soon returned, soft as breath but steady, as if the trees themselves whispered some secret language beneath the windless sky. By noon, Elise, normally the most cheerful of them all, was visibly shaking, her lips dry and cracked, eyes darting at shadows that flickered at the corners of her vision, her steps faltering until Madeline took her hand without a word. It was Carter who found the second clearing. Unlike the first, this one bore no sign, no marker of human presence, only a massive, gnarled tree at its center, its bark blackened, its twisted limbs rising like the skeletal remains of some long-dead titan. And at its roots, bones. Piles of them. Human, animal. Broken, splintered, yellowed with unimaginable age. The friends stood frozen, breathless, the air thick with rot and something far fouler, something that clung to their tongues and crawled into their lungs, and it was Jonah, voice raw with fear, who whispered, "We should turn back." But the path behind them was gone. Where there had once been a trail, there was only dense forest, impenetrable thickets, and trees that seemed different. Closer, darker, as if the woods had shifted in their absence. Panic began to bloom in chests tight with terror, breaths quickening, voices rising in fractured arguments until Nolan, face pale, eyes wild, shouted for silence, for calm, for reason. And then they heard the footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not from any one direction but from everywhere, circling, advancing, growing louder with each heartbeat, and before any of them could move, could speak, the humming rose to a deafening crescendo. Impossible, unnatural, and the forest itself seemed to breathe, exhaling a wind that reeked of decay and old death. They ran. Branches slashed their faces, thorns tore at their clothes, and somewhere behind them, something gave chase, not with the crashing clumsiness of an animal but with deliberate, rhythmic footsteps that never faltered, never rushed, only pursued with endless patience as though it knew there was no true escape. By the time they stumbled into the next clearing, breathless, bloodied, and shaking, the sun was gone. And in the encroaching dark, the forest shifted again. It was as if the very air within that new clearing was diseased, thick with the coppery scent of old blood and something deeper. Something chemical and unnatural that left a bitter film on their tongues, made their eyes water, and as they gasped for breath, trembling, the five friends realized that the oppressive weight pressing against their chests was not merely fear but something alive, something that filled the air, the soil, the spaces between molecules with a malevolent sentience so vast that their minds could scarcely comprehend it. The trees surrounding the clearing were no longer merely trees. Their trunks twisted into grotesque, half-humanoid shapes, bark split and gaping as though frozen in silent screams, their branches shivering despite the utter stillness of the air, and the ground beneath their feet was soft, too soft, giving slightly under their weight, spongy and warm, as though they walked upon flesh rather than soil. Jonah fell first. One moment he was upright, his breath tearing ragged from his throat. The next he crumpled, his scream slicing the air as his legs sank through the ground with a sickening, wet pop. Madeline lunged for him instinctively, her hands closing around his arm, but the ground itself seemed to shudder, to convulse, and she too fell to her knees, her fingers meeting not dirt but something rubbery, slick, something that twitched beneath her touch. With a scream, she yanked Jonah free, his boot emerging coated in thick, gelatinous strands of something black and glistening, something that clung with an intelligence all its own. They fled again, blind, stumbling, driven by animal terror, but the hollow had changed, its geography distorted, the forest a labyrinth of impossible angles, endless corridors of twisted wood and root that seemed to double back upon themselves, trapping them in a shifting maze that defied all logic. The sky. What little they could see through the interlocking canopy, had turned the color of rust, the air humming now in a constant, throbbing pulse like the heartbeat of some vast subterranean beast. Hours passed, or minutes, or days, they could no longer tell. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, thirst parched their throats, but worse than either was the growing certainty that they were not alone. That something vast and ancient moved in the spaces between trees, watching, waiting, each step forward bringing them deeper into its waiting jaws. When they finally stumbled upon the old shack, it was so sudden, so abrupt, that for one surreal moment they thought it a hallucination, a rotted cabin half swallowed by the earth, its roof caved, its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Desperation overrode reason. They forced their way inside, the floor sagging beneath them, the air fetid with mold and rot, but it offered shelter, however temporary, from the impossible nightmare outside. Inside the shack, they found remnants of another life, broken furniture, rusted tools, and scrawled on the walls in what looked horribly like dried blood were words in jagged, frantic script. It sees you when you walk. It hears you when you run. It remembers the taste of your fear. As night fell, though the rust-colored sky never truly darkened, they huddled together in the corner, their breath visible in the frigid air, Elise sobbing softly, her fingers dug into Carter's sleeve with bruising force. The humming outside rose and fell like breath, the cabin itself shivering as though buffeted by a wind that did not exist, and none of them spoke, not even Nolan, whose rational mind had long since fractured beneath the weight of the impossible. Madeline was the first to see the face. Peering through a crack in the warped boards, she saw it, pale, eyeless, its skin stretched tight over bone, its mouth an impossibly wide grin of splintered teeth, and as its head cocked to one side in mechanical jerks, she realized with cold, dawning horror that the thing had no neck, no real body, only a face, floating, disembodied, grinning through the dark. Her scream shattered the fragile stillness. The door burst open. The thing, no, things, flowed inside, formless, shifting, their outlines flickering like candle flame, and the friends scattered in blind panic, overturning furniture, slamming themselves against walls as hands, too many hands, grasped from the dark. Jonah vanished first, simply gone, his scream cut off mid-breath. Then Elise, dragged backward into the gaping earth, her fingers raking bloody furrows in the floorboards as Carter howled her name. Only 3 remained when they burst from the cabin into the night, bloodied, breathless, their sanity hanging by the thinnest of threads, and ahead of them loomed the impossible, a chasm that split the earth itself, yawning wide, the source of the low, endless hum, a throat carved into the heart of black hollow that led, down into the dark. And something waited there, awake, aware, and hungry. The 3 remaining survivors, Madeline, Carter, and Nolan, stood trembling on the jagged lip of the chasm, their breath frosting in the poisoned air, their minds fracturing beneath the terrible knowledge that escape was no longer possible, that they had crossed some hidden threshold and entered a reality that bore no resemblance to the world they had once known. Beneath them, the vast throat of the hollow exhaled its endless breath, a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through their bones, their teeth, their skulls, until it felt as though their very blood sang in time with the rhythm of the thing that slept, or worse, woke, beneath the earth. Madeline could barely stand. Her legs shook uncontrollably, her heart hammering an uneven stutter of terror. Carter's face was unrecognizable, mask-like, his lips peeled back in a permanent rictus of horror, while Nolan, poor, rational Nolan, muttered to himself in hoarse, dry whispers, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow as though he could see something the others could not. The decision to move was not made but forced. The ground behind them shifted, split, as if the forest itself pushed them toward the abyss, and with no other choice, they descended. First along a narrow path of slick, moss-covered stone that wound downward in impossible spirals, then through narrow crevices where the air grew colder still, carrying with it the fetid stench of rot and old blood. Their hands brushed against walls that pulsed subtly beneath their fingertips, as though the rock itself possessed veins, a heartbeat, a breath. Hours passed, or none at all, in that timeless dark. Their flashlights sputtered and failed, leaving them in a soft, bioluminescent glow that oozed from the walls, painting their faces in sickly green light. And all the while, the whispers grew louder. Not voices. Not words. Memories. Madeline heard her father's voice calling her from childhood, the sound warped, stretched, made monstrous by distance and distortion. Carter saw his dead sister's face in the stones, her lips moving silently, her empty eye sockets weeping black ichor. Nolan wept openly now, clawing at his ears, his breath hitching in short, panicked gasps as he staggered onward blindly. The tunnel ended at last in a cavern so vast that its ceiling was lost in darkness. The floor writhed with what appeared at first to be roots, until those roots shifted, and Madeline realized with a horrified whimper that they were bones, fused together into a living, undulating mass that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the center of the chamber, rising like a tumor from the floor, was the altar, an obscene growth of flesh and stone, veined with pulsing arteries, crowned with what could only be described as a mouth, vast and toothless, quivering in anticipation. The three stood frozen, unable to breathe, to speak, to scream. And then Nolan stepped forward. His body moved without his will. His face twisted in terror, his hands outstretched as though pulled by invisible strings. Madeline lunged, her scream echoing through the cavern, but Carter held her back, his own eyes glazed, his body shivering as something unseen whispered directly into the wet folds of his mind. Nolan reached the altar. The mouth opened. There was no blood, no violence. Only the soft, wet sound of flesh parting, of bone dissolving, as Nolan vanished inch by inch into the thing's waiting throat, his eyes wide, his breath hitching in silent screams until there was nothing left but a red smear and the whisper of his voice, echoing in the air long after his body was gone. Madeline collapsed. Carter knelt beside her, both of them shaking, unable to look away from the thing that pulsed before them, its flesh shimmering, its hunger unsated. And in that moment of perfect horror, they understood. The hollow was not a place. It was not even a creature. It was a god. And they were its offering. The final descent was not made on foot but in dreams. Madeline awoke, or thought she did, within a corridor of bone, her feet bare upon flesh-warmed stone, the air humid with breath. Carter was there beside her, or perhaps it was his shadow, his soul, something left of him but not truly him, and they walked hand in hand without choice, without volition, as the walls themselves whispered secrets in voices older than the sky. The whispers told her of the hollow's birth, of the thing beneath, vast beyond comprehension, that had slumbered since the first heartbeat of the world. They showed her flashes of ancient rites, of generations of pilgrims who had come willingly or not, who had fed the hunger that must never die, and she saw, through tears she could not shed, that they were not the first nor the last. They reached the heart at last. It was not a chamber but a womb, a space beyond dimensions, where the meat of reality thinned and split, and through its slick, translucent walls she glimpsed horrors that no human tongue could describe. Beings without form, without mercy, that swam through oceans of black flame, their eyeless faces pressed to the veil between worlds. And in the center of it all, the core, the true mouth of the hollow, waited. It opened not outward but inward, folding reality upon itself, and Madeline knew, that to fall into it was to be undone, to be rewritten, to be made into something less and more than human. Carter screamed, a thin, keening sound, and vanished, pulled apart like smoke in a gale. Madeline alone remained. And the hollow spoke to her. It was not in words but sensation, cold and heat, pressure and absence, love and hate fused into one perfect command. Become. Her flesh split without pain. Her bones melted, reformed. Her memories stretched, unraveled, reknitted. And as her mind dissolved into something vast and old and monstrous, she saw the surface world through new eyes, the endless forests, the rivers, the mountains, all of it prey, all of it hers. When she awoke, she stood once more at the edge of the hollow, alone, her skin pale and perfect, her eyes white as bone. Her friends were gone, consumed or transformed, but she remained as the new herald, her voice filled with the endless hum of the god beneath, her footsteps silent as she walked the forest once more, calling others to feed. The cycle would never end. The hunger would never cease. And Black Hollow would endure, forever.